Welcome back. So now we start to have our second panel. This one is sliding. All right. I'm Wang Zheng, Professor of Women's Studies and History at the University of Michigan. I'm very delighted and honored to be asked to moderate this session. This panel is titled Of and By the Women. You know why they asked me to moderate this one. So we are going to have three speakers to give you wonderful images. I just had a peek of all these PPTs, several PPTs. You know, you are going to be delighted to see all those interesting, very interesting images. So we are going to have our first speaker, Dr. Zheng Wenqian. Wenqian Zheng is here. Dr. Zheng is a senior curator and Louise Harley-Stone Chair of Chinese Art at the Royal Ontario Museum. She received her PhD in art history at the University of Michigan, of course, under the supervision of Professor Marty in 2003. She joined the Royal Ontario Museum in 2011 as the Louise Harley-Stone Chair of Chinese Art. She is cross-appointed in the Department of East Asia Studies at the University of Toronto. Before joining the ROM, Dr. Zheng taught courses of Asian art history at University of Michigan and the Pennsylvania State University at University Park. She was the guest curator and catalog author for a couple of exhibitions held at the UMMA. At ROM, she co-curated a major exhibition, The Forbidden City, Inside the Court of China's Emperors, in 2014. She was the main contributor to the catalog accompanying the exhibition held at Berlin 2017-18, Faces of China, Chinese portrait painting of the Ming and Qing dynasties, which includes the loan of over 40 Chinese portrait paintings from the ROM. Currently, she has been working on curating an exhibition, Gods in My Home, Chinese New Year with Ancestor Portraits and Deity Prints, to be held in ROM January 2019. Her research interests focus on pre-modern Chinese paintings, including the genre subject of Song Dynasty painting images of women and ancestor portraits and prints in late imperial periods. The title of her paper today is Boundary Crossing, Portraiture or Paintings of Beautiful Women, ? Welcome, Dr. Zheng.
Thank you for Professor Wang's very generous introduction. I just want to say I'm extremely honored to be here. Thank you for JP organizing the event in occasion of celebrating our Professor Marty's very deserved retirement. And I also I only have one word to say to Marty. You taught us well, and thank you. Okay, so let me speak. Okay. The genre of the 仕女, painting of the gentleman woman, or 美人画, painting of the beautiful woman, developed as early as the Tang Dynasty and went through some transformation during the Songyuan period. Their popularity became ever more evident in the Ming and Qing periods when the scope of the genre expanded. Such a depiction of the woman in general relied on a long-established convention of the pictorial tropes as well as literary devices. They are considered the representation of generic pictures of women with no name attached. Many recent scholars view them as objects of male desire. I just want to mention Professor Wu Hong sitting on the back. He has recently just have a book on this whole genre of the 仕女 published in Chinese. I look forward to read the book, but I don't think it's available yet. A type of the 美人 paintings that depicts an individual beautiful woman at its center, occasionally accompanied by a young maid, become prevalent from the late 17th century onward. Their close-to-life-size feature is visually compelling, giving the viewer a sense of a real person portrait. Even though often no name was attached to the lady, in many examples, she appears like a real person posing for a portrait. On the other hand, many portraits of naked women, which bear little or no real-life person trails, were produced when portraiture emerged as an important genre of the painting during the same period. This phenomenon raised the question about the boundary crossing between the 美人画 genre and the female portraiture. This paper well considered the expectation of the viewers and the patrons with respect to interchanged ability in representing both generalized and individualized female qualities. In particular, the audience's relatively free associations or imaginations of the subject allows the two similarly separated genres to intersect in representing the quality of female beauty and the sentimental feelings. I will begin with my discussion with a particular type of the genre, a type of the 美人画 that represent a single beauty as the focal point. The larger hanging score is usually their typical format. They were, oh, by the way, if you see here wrong and with a section number, that means the painting is from the Royal Ontario Museum collections. So the larger hanging scroll is their typical format. They were mostly likely to be hung on the wall for viewing. The physical beauty of the lady is an obvious feature in these paintings. They had been seen in earlier 美人画 as well. On the screen, the lady's body is an ideal stereotype that was popularized since the Ming Dynasty in the modes established by Qiu Ying. For example, this from Qiu Ying, a detail from the Hangong Chunxiao. Especially, she has sloping shoulders and slim body, and over face. Oops, sorry, I pushed the wrong button. Uh-oh, I turned it off. How did I turn? Sorry about that. Oh, there's a blackout button. Oh, now finally we see the beautiful faces. Typically, they have this oval face, narrow and elongated phoenix eyes, very thin willow leaf-like eyebrows, cherry-like small lips. However, because of their larger sizes, the artists were able to individualize the lady's facial features to a certain extent. So if you look closely, they actually do not appear so standardized as the typical earlier beauties in Qiu Ying and the Tang Ying's mode. If compared with this Tang Ying painting, each of the ladies here somehow has a different sort of features there. The woman in the life-size 美人画 may appear more sexually attractive compared to the early 美人 picture because of their more provocative postures. The ladies often sit casually in a willowy manner, sometimes with her one leg bent on a chair or daybed, revealing her the fare of the laziness or ease. The lady on the left, images on the screen, exposed her tiny bum feet in the red shoes. Here it is. It's large. A definite sign of the upbringing and eroticism, because women with bum feet were considered privileged, delicate, and sexy in the Ming-Qing era. Other subtle visual cues for the sexuality include the lady's chin resting upon her delicate hand, the way she holds a fan, a flower, or painting her eyebrows, etc. All these gestures expose her charming fingers with long fingernails. Unlike the rather mannerism or statue-like postures depicting also sexually appealing the court ladies of the Tang Dynasty in early periods, the nuances expressed in this lady's gesture make them appear more like a real person, real world person, the one image on the left. Another common feature is that the objects surrounding the beauties are conventionally associated with romantic feeling and the longings. For example, the round fan carries the connotation of a woman's love-longed states. The double bracelet is a symbol of a reunion of the two lovers. If you can notice this on the table. And this lady is also holding a pair here. Moreover, these aromatous ladies are often pictured alone in their private boudoirs or gardens, places where romantic engagements take place in literature. Overall, a large part of the sexual iconography in this 美人画 was not completely new. But most scholars agree that many of the large-sized 美人 paintings deliver a broader erotic messages. The beauties, youthfulness, and sensualities are strongly presented, in part because of their enlarged format, allowing the painter's detailed attention. Most distinctly, it may be the gaze of these ladies that draw in the viewers' romantic, erotic imaginations. For the first time in the 美人 genre, these ladies gaze directly at the viewer, as if they had been waiting for the viewer to come or posting for the portrait. Because of their highly suggestive sexual elements, some scholars have proposed reading them as generic images of the courtesan who flourished in the context of laming to early Qing erotic culture. However, I would like to further suggest that the 美人 pictures reflect a wider phenomena, what may be termed as the cult of the Qing, emotions and feelings, under which the gentleman's pursuit of the courtesans was only one manifestation. Bearing this large context in mind, for the purpose of this paper, I will focus on reconsidering the issues of the ladies' identities, viewers' expectations, and the function of these paintings. First, as we have seen, there seems to be an interest in making the woman a unique person rather than a generic 美人. Could this point suggest that some of the so-called 美人画 might have truly served the function as the portrait of a specific lady? Several years ago, the late Professor James Cahill, the creation of his scroll, some of us have viewed in Uma's collection today. He actually argued precisely the opposite. He admitted that a painting of what later he regarded as 美人画, or generic images of women, was first considered by him and his students as a portrait of a famous female poet named Liu Ying, based on inscriptions. This is the painting. Yet, when other paintings of women with closer similarities, such as the one from the, keep doing this. Okay. Such as the one from the Royal Ontario Museum collection, came to his attention, he decided that these paintings were not portraits at all, but merely 美人画. Then there was the discovery of another images of a lady with the same posture, yet identified as a self-portrait of a famous courtesan and artist in an inscription. Based on the existence of the two versions of the picture, Professor Cahill eliminated the possibility of either being a true portrait. In the end, he even made an effort to track down what he believed a real portrait of Liu Ying that includes a lengthy inscriptions. This image, he didn't mention the source where the image was published or collected. It's a very tiny black and white image in his book, so I didn't include it here. In this image, Liu Ying appears, quote, very unsexy, unquote, using his words, and was portrayed, quote, in a way the real person would have chosen to be portrayed, unquote, as a famous literary woman. I'm intrigued by Professor Cahill's conclusion and his endeavor to find a true portrait of Liu Ying. However, I would like to bring a new perspective that may overturn Professor Cahill's belief that earlier he had made a mistake. I propose to view these images of so-called portraits of Liu Ying, both portraits and 美人画. In other words, there was neither false inscription nor misidentification. There was only a matter of made to believe. First, let us begin with a reconsideration of how the original viewer might have perceived such a female images. Was there a clear division between an image of generic beauty and an individual portrait as assumed by modern viewers? I must mention that Professor Judith Zidlin has already proposed this idea in the context of discussing female self-portrait in the Chinese popular fiction and drama. From the popular literature of the Ming and Qing periods, revealingly, it is not uncommon to find the paintings regarded as a 真容, true portrait of a woman that may also be called a 美人画. For example, in the Jinping Mei, the main character Xi Menqing commissioned a posthumous portrait of his beloved wife, Li Ping'er, for use of her funeral ritual. After some corrections made by the painter to capture her likeness, the families and friends praised the portrait as a beautiful woman picture. Another popular drama found in the Ming author Michelson compendium Liu Zhiji described how a woman made a portrait of her deceased daughter and tried to sell it as a 美人画 to a household high-ranking official. The popularities of this type of story, even though in a fictional world, must have reflected the common people's view of the 美人画. The Qing dynasty painter Wang Yuanxun specialized in painting images of women. According to Wang's biography, unmarried ladies and gentlewomen, young or old, all sought him to commission their portraits. Why? Because in addition to being good at capturing the likeness of women, he was capable of, quote, enhancing a flair of deductiveness, unquote, 真妩媚, which is indeed a central feature of the 美人画. Not surprisingly, the author of this biography further commented on how vividly wonderful a 美人画 the painter painted for him. All this story seems to suggest when it comes to a portrait of a beautiful woman, it was no mistake to view it also as a 美人画. It might explain why what puzzles Professor Cahill in the first place, a painting looking like a real, like a 美人 picture actually bears terms like 写真, 真相, 画真 in its title. And often, these were said to be portraits of famous beauties, whether poets, courtesans, or historical heroines, and so forth. My concern, however, is not whether we can identify a true portrait of any individual lady in the 美人 picture, with or without a name attached to. The point I would like to make is that the type of look real portraits of 美人画 could provide an opportunity for its buyer freely to associate the beauty with a real or imagined persona. This association, in turn, provides one of the painting's functions, that is, to fulfill the romantic imagination of its viewers. As we have seen, the physical beauty and the romantic feeling of the female are the focus in such paintings. The following story is revealing in this respect. A scholar named Wang Zhuo once wrote an elegy titled Funeral Elegies for the Beauty in the Painting, which gave an account about how he came across and bought a picture of a beautiful woman. He had haunted it in his bedchamber for many years. Yet one night, a gust of wind blew the painting down, which fell upon the lighted lamp and caught on fire. The lady in the picture was gone before he could put out the fire. He was heartbroken, and thus wrote the elegies, in which he revealed his affection towards the ladies. I remember that when I first opened this lady, this beauty, I was only 15 years old. Morning and night, I faced her, regretting the belatedness of our meeting. In the moonlight, whenever a cool breeze wafted in, my beauty would gently stir as though she were about to move. But if drawn near, she would stop. I was always ashamed that, unlike the gentleman who called the lovely Zhenzhen down from the painted screen after 49 days, my devotion could never cause my beauty to step down from the paper. The following year, in 1652, I married Miss Lu, but she died only a few years later, and in 1659, I took Miss Zhou as my new wife. My beauty lived with me without interruption through both my marriages. So Wang's fantasy of an image of the lady coming to life from a painting had a long literary tradition that can be traced to the Tang Dynasty, the story of Zhenzhen as mentioned in his elegy. The theme of such 画中美人, or beauty in the painting, coming to life that was kept alive through many more popular fictions and dramas of similar nature in later periods. We may consider the famous story of the Du Li Niang in Tang Xianzu's the Peony Pavilion, Mudan Ting, the most complex reinvention of such a thing. The story involves the main female character's self-portrait making, which is like a 美人画, and the restoration of her life through the power of love and desire. I should mention that my classmate, Laura, a next presenter, who also wrote an excellent paper discussing this agenda, the subjectivity surrounding the Du Li Niang's self-portrait making. She also have a book on the also image of women, the Song Dynasty, the desire and the longing, right? Yes. In current incident, Wang's elegy gives us a chance to see how an educated married man actually react upon acquiring a 美人 painting from his real-life experience. Wang indeed notes in his account of the painting's purchase that he regretted not being able to find the identity of the woman in the picture. It implies that he saw the painting as a portrait of the real person. However, it certainly did not stop him from fantasizing their relationship, which he claimed did not seem to interfere his two marriages. We would naturally assume that the beauty Wang fantasized about must be a lady of a courtesan status. However, I suggest that she does not need to be. In other words, there is some fluidity in her identity in such paintings, open for gentlemen's imaginations. Xu Zhen, actively slightly later than the period of Wang, wrote a popular piece titled The Menu of the Beautiful Women, which first appeared as the introduction to his collection of short stories called A Book of Talented Women. As the title suggests, it was meant to serve as a manual or guide for the gentleman's interest in the beautiful woman. He opens his essay with an explanation. I have collected the paragons of the beauty and compiled a menu of the taste in the tender realm. Now, gentlemen of the style and the culture, and those talented who long for the voluptuous, can finally search for the happiness based on this guide. He lists the three categories of beauty, and in each he identifies names from the early times who he thinks deserve to be the subject of gentlemen's affection. This list includes not only the famous courtesan, concubines, and maids whose roles as lovers and partners were more evident, but also historical women and heroines, ranging from the imperial consorts, wives of gentlemen, to renowned poets. Their original stories, however, do not necessarily highlight the romances. Yet, now they all can be romanticized under the rubric of 美人 in the menu. Following the list, she exemplifies the 10 iconographies or attributes of the 美人, which include categories of her physical appearances, skill, talents, activity, food, and so forth. The category of 趣, literally means fun, even describes the 6 sexually arousing moods a 美人 could provide to a gentleman. So now, one can imagine how a gentleman fell into his daydreaming after reading the menu. Apparently, the so-called guide for the gentleman's search for the happiness in woman was not so much a user manual containing practical instructions. Instead, it was a booklet for their imaginative indulgences. The menu provides us a range of the repertoire for the Marian images in words. It largely parallels what we have found in the Marian images in pictures. Here on the screen is a good example, an 8-leafed albums of the wide-ranging landed Marian images. All these women were historical figures, some with the more or less sort of legendary nature. So I will just run through them. So their name actually is here, you can see, and they're each accompanied by a poem describing basically their stories. Although they are painted in a much smaller format, the album leaf, they share similar pictorial schemes found in larger size Marian pictures, except they appear to zoom out with more inclusion of the setting. The image of the 曹大家, Ban Zhao, from the set is an interesting example. It shows how a historical figure, female figure, who was known for her literary talents instead of appearances, was romanticized under the rubric of Marian. She's depicted in a very laid-back, seated pose that is considered very sexy and often seen in the generic Marian images. As now we understood, such images and Xu Zhen's text share a similar function of evoking the romantic imaginations. This function of the Marian Hua convinced me there is no reason why the identity assigned to the Wang Zhuo's beloved lady in painting should be rigid. His beauty could be cast in the roles of a courtesan, a concubine, a maid, a writer, or many others. The flexibility of the lady's identity and the fact that he can be attached with a known persona surely increase the popularity of the seemingly generic Marian pictures. In light of this, the so-called issues of Liu Ying's identity in all those paintings discovered by late Professor Cahill's was never really a problem to their original viewers. Now I would like to briefly turn to another type, the female portraits, the informal portraits of a talented woman that emerges in the late imperial periods. Like their male counterpart, educated Chinese women could involve themselves in commissioning their informal portraits. These portraits can be considered parallel to the male informal literati portrait, or 行乐图, picture of the leisure activities. They provide public cultivated images as well as personal characterization of the sitters. For the male patrons, to some degree, the true portrait quality was expected in such portraits. The sitters' faces are often rendered in a manner to capture their individuality. In some extent, the informal female portrait, one does find certain degree of likeness of the woman's face. For example, on the screen is a portrait by Cao Xiuzhen. She herself commissioned the portraits to paint her. Yet her case is relatively rare, or we should say not many such paintings survived. More often seen in informal female portraits are not so personalized faces, and they were made for more diverse purpose than typical 行乐图. I have actually explored elsewhere in another symposium paper a case of an effigy female portrait of a certain Lady Xiao in which the subject died at a young age. The portrait was commissioned posthumously a few years after her passing away, leaving the painter no chance to capture her true likeness. I have found her image resembles a portrait of a known female writer, Qu Bingyun. In fact, many comparable portraits could be found. In these portraits, the likeness of each individual seems to concern neither the artist nor the audience. What matters more is the ideal type, as well as the way these images are presented. All these are shared in the repertoire of the 仕女 or Marian genre, especially when it comes to represent the young and talented female persona. Upon a closer look, this effigy portrait of a Lady Xiao indeed bears traces of the generic beautiful woman painting. She is portrayed as both a refined gentry lady and an attractive woman. This poetry serves, as I have argued elsewhere, not only the purpose of remembering her, but also eternalizing her youthful look, which regretfully vanished in a premature death. Encouraged by the increasing sentimental culture in the late imperial period, preserving the youthful beauty through the female portraits had become a notable desire, at least in the literature tropes and the popular accounts. When a female portrait functions to fulfill the desire of preserving her beautiful appearances as well as her emotions, the painting conflates with the portrait like a 美人画. So on the screen, there's three sort of a mixture of the so-called 美人画 and female portraits. So without the inscription, they're all overlapping features make it really hard to tell which is a 美人画, which is a portrait painting. I will end my talk with the discussion of one more images. A large hanging scroll that depicts a life-size woman as the focal point. The painting cited by the Wang Tingyu, about whom we know nothing, here is his signature, was mostly likely made in the late 19th century, judging from the very three-dimensional effect of the objects, special arrangements, single light sources and shadowing, etc. Like many earlier 美人画, the casual-seated woman gaze at the viewer bears a common physical appearance of a beauty. The setting is typical of a study with books and cultivated objects, if you compare to the earlier ones. But what looks different in this painting is that the objects are spread around in a rather casual manner. If you look closely, the cabinet door kind of swings open with the clothes actually hanging on the top. And also there is this inkstone, ink still wet here. A book also with the open pages sit on the top of the pile of the books. So such a casual environment gives the viewer a sense of realness. This is not a setting for painting, but a real living space. The messy appearance, along with the several objects typically used in the male space, such as this, soon makes the viewer realize that the lady is in immense study. Interestingly, her invisible partner reveals his identity as the painter himself by including a depiction of a 2-volume text of the secret of the portraiture with his name inscribed as the author sitting on the bookshelf. 王听瑜传神要诀. So not incidentally, this 美人 is transformed in her vivid physical presence to look like a portrait of the real person. After all, the painter saw himself as a skilled portraitist who knew all about the secret of the portraiture. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we are going to have Liu Bo. She is Associate Professor of Art History and Humanities at John Carroll University. Professor Liu's research interests include the paintings of the Tang, Song, and Yuan dynasties. Her research has focused on political expression in Song painting, the malleability of pictorial motifs, and the expressive potential of images with or without texts. She is currently working on 2 murals from the Northern Song and Jin dynasties. She is interested in the relationship between tombs, murals, images that were meant to serve the deceased, and paintings circulated among the living. Trained as an art historian and an archaeologist, she hopes to use methodologies and perspectives from the 2 disciplines and contribute to the current studies in the 2 fields, including discerning the stylistic differences between Northern Song and Jin tombs, searching for literati art tradition during the Jin dynasty, and dating some problematic paintings from this turbulent historical period. Today, Professor Liu's talks the title for Professor Liu's talk is Images of Women in Southern Song Tomb Murals. Welcome, Professor Liu.
Okay, the images in my PowerPoint is probably do not look as attractive as Professor Wen Qianzheng's PowerPoint, and also the paintings look kind of homely, but I would prove that they are similarly important, okay? Images of women in Northern Song tomb mirrors. Since the foundation of the People's Republic of China, archaeological excavations have yielded abundant findings of painted and sculpted tombs from the Northern Song dynasty. Chinese archaeologists' research findings have provided important information regarding the tomb's dates, regional and periodical styles. Chinese scholars are also interested in the variety of subject matter in these tombs, but generally focused on the meaning and ritual significance of the tomb setting. Some occasionally compare the images from these tombs to extant Tang and Song dynasty paintings. However, such comparison is often limited to comparison of subject matter. Art historical analysis, including composition, painting technique, and the relationships between text and images, are rarely seen. There are historical reasons for this lack of art historical study of Song tomb murals. Scholars who work on these murals are largely trained as archaeologists, whose methodologies, perspectives, and interests are often different from those of art historians. On the other hand, the majority of Chinese and Western art historians focus on paintings that have been handed down over the time, only occasionally attending to visual materials discovered in tombs. This paper will explore the relationship between mortuary art, tomb murals, and secular art, paintings created for living persons. Focusing on the images of women in Northern Song painted tombs, I will address how these images can contribute to the studies of Song Dynasty Shinu II, images of refined women or images of gentle women. First, the issue of different media. The assumption that images of women in tomb mirrors and Shinu II produced for non-mortuary use are closely related needs to be proved before using these tomb mirrors to address art historical issues. Outside of the tomb art, surviving Shinu II from the Song dynasty were collected and passed on to later generations and regarded as high-quality artwork. Writings on Shinu II from the Song mainly discuss famed artists and collectible art pieces as well. Tomb murals from the Northern Song dynasty, however, were mostly from burials of low-rank officials, mid-class merchants, and landlords, and were very likely produced by less well-known painters. In spite of the differences in technical quality and possibly aesthetic values, there are many similarities between Northern Song tomb murals and extant Southern Song Shinu II that indicate close ties between the two, and therefore support the methodology of using tomb murals to study the general development of Shinu II. For example, women grooming is a popular subject in both media. As we can see here, images of women grooming in Northern Song tomb murals often show a woman sitting in front of a mirror, assisted by maids. Such iconography was also popular in Southern Song Shinu II paintings. References to women looking into a mirror are also seen in Song literature, and in many cases were used as metaphors for lonely women who pined for their lovers. Song writings also suggest that Shinu paintings of women looking into mirrors tended to evoke the same sentiments as in Southern Song literature. It is not certain if such images in tombs carry the same overtones in various contexts, but the similarities between the tomb murals and the Shinu II paintings indicate a connection between the two, at least at a basic iconographic level. The mural of a mother taking care of children in Li Shougui's tomb supports the above argument as well. In this mural, the woman, assisted by a young maid, is tending two boys. she holds the younger one in her arm while passing an object, possibly a snack, to the bigger boy. Like women grooming, child care is also a popular subject in Shinu II from the Southern Song period. These two are fan paintings from the Southern Song period, and here we see a woman, a maid, and they're taking care of kids. There is an interesting detail in this mural, this one. A cat looking out at the audience while holding a bird in its mouth. The same motif appears in a Southern Song fan painting that depicts a boy playing with his cats. So here we see this cat is also kind of looking out at the audience. And in this painting, the cat also looks out at us and holds an unidentifiable object in its mouth, which we can see here. Similarly, a tomb dated to the early phase of the Jin Dynasty, Jin Dynasty is right after Northern Song, contains a mural featuring an image of pounding cloth. So this one, a favorite subject for artists of the Song Dynasty. And the upper painting is is attributed to the famous emperor artist Huizong. The similarities in composition and figure depiction between this mural and the famous Northern Song copy by Emperor Huizong are apparent. The Chinese scholar Yang Hong has already suggested that both artists use the same fenben. It's like a sample painting that many artists followed, that was circulated during the time. Another point of comparison between Northern Song tomb murals and secular paintings is the phenomenon of artists writing signatures and sometimes inscriptions on their works. As textual records and extant paintings suggest, artists from early China did not sign their paintings, nor did they write any inscriptions on the paintings. Artists from the early Northern Song, including masters such as Li Cheng and Xu Daoning, follow this tradition as well. The earliest extant painting that bears the artist's signature is by Fan Quan. This tiny signature, which is hidden somewhere here, however, was hidden in the tree and wasn't discovered until 1958 by two modern Chinese art historians. It was during Emperor Shenzong's reign that many artists started to sign their paintings at a more visible place. It was during, the court artist Cui Bai, the painter of this hand scroll, left a short signature on his painting Cold Sparrows. While Guo Xi, the famous Northern Song painter, wrote the title of the painting, the year, his name, and also stamped his seal on the painting. This is the artist's own seal. Similar parallels can be found in mortuary art. No artist names are left on the painted walls or carved sarcophagi of early tombs. There is barely any information extant about those image makers. In the late Northern Song period, names of painters appeared in a few tombs. The tomb of a man named Song Silang, which was dated 1126, included the names of the brick workers and the painter. So the brick worker, Dr. Jia, Dr. Liu, back then, those craftsmen, they were called doctors, okay? And then the artist is Yang Biao. Okay. Moreover, based on the format of the text, the painter Yang Biao seems to be the one who wrote the whole text. To some extent, this is not that different from an inscription on a secular painting by its artist. The fact that the tomb builders and painters' names were written on the spot of a signboard here, so this is the entrance to the tomb, and the artist's names are written here, okay? And also the tomb owner's name. So this fact is noteworthy. The sign shows the tomb belonged to Mr. Song Silang, but it also states that it was constructed by the hands of 3 capable craftsmen or even artists. The practice of recording the painters' names was seen more often in the subsequent Jin Dynasty. In some cases, the writers were undoubtedly the painters themselves, such as the 1158 tomb in Changzi, Shanxi province. A tomb in Ganquan, Shanxi province, even included a portrait of a certain craftsman, Li Boshi. So this inscription reads, "This person is Dr. Li." Okay. Painted at the eye level on the narrow wall, narrow entrance to a tomb. So this is where the painting, the portrait of the artist is located. So this is the entrance to the tomb, and then this part is a tomb chamber. Okay, and as we can see here, the portrait is it's life size. Okay, so you won't miss it if you have the chance to visit a tomb. Although not a finely portrayed self-portrait, its significance is not that different from the small portrait sculpture of Lorenzo Alberti at the Gates of Paradise. Both served as a signature of the artist who proudly announced their authorship on their own artwork. Such evidence proves the connection between mortuary and secular painting in terms of iconography, subject matter, and other artistic practices. The main function of the majority of Song Dynasty tomb murals was to provide the dead a comfortable post-mortem environment. However, mural painters in the Northern Song and the following Jin Dynasty were also exposed to and subsequently adopted some of the prevailing artistic expressions from artists of higher social and artistic status. It affirms the hypothesis that images of women in tomb murals can be used to study Shunyu Tu of the Northern Song period. In my recent article, Physical Beauty and Inner Virtue, Shunyu Tu in the Song Dynasty, I pointed out a major difference between Shunyu Tu in the Tang and Song dynasties. While Tang artists focused on the physical attractiveness of the female figures, Song painters tended to understate the outward appearance and instead highlight cultural and artistic cultivation and other womanly virtues, such as child rearing. Some pictures we already saw. The Dancer is a screen painting excavated from a tomb of the Tang Dynasty, and we know it belonged to a specific person called Zhang Lichen. The blank background invites the viewer to place full attention on the painted woman. Indeed, the artist provided the viewers an attractive woman to appreciate. She has colorful clothing, a neat hairdo, a well-adorned face, and facial features typical of a Tang Dynasty beauty. The deep V-shaped opening in the front reveals her cleavage, which the artist drew with two short lines. Another example is the court ladies wearing flowers, a painting attributed to the famous artist Zhou Fang, which shows the female figures similar to the excavated painting from the Tang tomb. This painting contains 6 women who are playing with pets, gazing at flowers, or simply strolling around. All of the ladies are dressed in fine clothes and are wearing fancy headpieces. The second lady deserves close examination. Okay. Her full figure and plump cheeks were considered to be feminine and attractive in the Tang. Like other 5 ladies, she wears elegant, expensive, and revealing clothes. Her chest and part of her shoulder are exposed, and her transparent shawl shows much of her upper body. We can actually see through the fabric. We see the lady is lifting her collar with her delicate right hand, an action that will reveal more of her body to the audience. The artist used this nuanced gesture, in addition to the delicate fabric, her lovely face and elegant pose, to encourage the audience, mostly likely men, to appreciate her charm through close examination and lingering imagination. Female beauty, including sexuality, was successfully rendered without descending into crude pornography. Typical Shunyu Tu from the Southern Song feature another type of woman. The female figures in both of the paintings appear to be well educated. On their table, books, scrolls, and even antiques are displayed. We see books, right? Here, 1 or 2 scrolls, either calligraphy or painting. Well, for this mom, she plays qin zither, an instrument that previously associated with only refined male scholars. And we see a pile of books, some scrolls, and even bronzeware from like 3 dynasties of China. So she also collects antiques. So these items describe the portrayed women as active pursuers of art and culture. They are intellectuals instead of merely good-looking ladies. Also, the small size of the figures doesn't leave much opportunity for the artist to represent and the viewers to appreciate their physical charms. That's not the point. Okay? Northern Song artists and also Southern Song artists, they put the inner virtue at the priority of over the physical looks. So Song artists presented them as virtuous women with refined cultural tastes. The difference between the two types of 仕女图 is obvious. However, most of the extant 仕女图 are from Southern Song period, including these two fan paintings. Our knowledge of this painting genre in the Northern Song is extremely limited. For example, we do not know the answers to some basic but important questions, such as when the above changes occurred during the Northern Song dynasty. Oh, I forgot to show this detail so we can see better the items that belong to these two ladies. For example, we don't know the answers to some basic but important questions, such as when the above change from a Tang-style 仕女 to Song dynasty-style 仕女 happened. Did it happen in lockstep with the dynastical transitions, or did it evolve at a different pace? Textual documents suggest that Tang-style 仕女 images were passed on to masters in the 5 dynasties and then to the Northern Song period by artists like Zhou Wenju and Wang Juzheng, and artists active in the late decades of the Northern Song period. Starting from the mid-Northern Song period, however, many scholars, including like famous artists and writers, Guo Ruxu and Mei Yaocheng, started to express their dislike of the Tang style. Those charming, physical, beautiful ladies. They favored 仕女 paintings that highlighted women's inner virtues instead of their physical attractiveness. Those virtues often included a woman's literary and artistic cultivation. In addition to those mentioned in the Northern Song poems, Xuanhe Huapu, the imperial painting catalog of Xianhe era, recorded 3 仕女 paintings by 2 Northern Song artists, women composing poetry by Hou Yi, and 2 poets chanting poems by Wu Dongqing. However, these paintings are long lost. The earliest extant 仕女图 that feature women as intellectuals are all from the Southern Song period. Fortunately, mirrors from the Northern Song tombs have provided valuable materials that can fill this vacuum. A painted tomb from Xinmi, Henan province, contains 2 mirrors that depict a woman reading and writing. Okay, so they're not that well preserved, but we can see here on this painting, this woman is holding a brush, right? And she's writing on a blank, long hand scroll, assisted by a young girl, while here, this box presumably holding books. Well, in this picture, it's even harder to see, but we can see that the one hand of the woman is here. Well, there's something in front of her, while this lady is holding a scroll in hand. According to the reporters, okay, this woman is also writing something. Okay, so the poor quality of many tomb murals is also one of the reasons that's why they attract less art historians' attention, because they're kind of hard to study because of the poor quality. The 2 images distinguish themselves from many other murals that contain women in that this latter, the other images, 2 mirrors from Song dynasty, they were largely about providing services to the dead, such as preparing food and drinks or offering entertainment. These 2, however, do not show a direct link to the life of the dead. If there was a link, they could be images that represent the ideal type of women as viewed by the tomb owners. In this sense, they are not different from other 仕女图 paintings. Women as intellectuals are generally a new theme in the Song dynasty 仕女图, as was recorded in Northern Song text and represented in many extant Southern Song paintings. In addition to the 3 paintings recorded in the imperial catalog of Xianhe era, which might have depicted women chanting or writing a poem, the Song scholar Mei Yaocheng also left a poem that describes a painting which bore the image of women writing. It's a long poem. I only included the last several verses here. A brush in hand, she is writing small characters, so she means the lady in the painting. Her writing reveals her personality, and her appearance deserves close viewing. Her appearance is preserved in the painting and will stay like that forever, defying the passing of time. She will not age. Viewing it again and again, this familiar face will bring spring to your eyes. As a long-time companion, this painting is a lily that will help you forget your worries. Apparently, the lady in the painting is preserved for her writing, right, instead of her look. In this poem, Michelson expressed his appreciation of the women who had literary and artistic cultivation. However, like most 仕女图 from the Northern Song period, this painting that Michelson is writing about is lost. These two murals from 1108, so the last decade of the Northern Song, offer us the earliest visual evidence of such images. They suggest that the images of women as intellectuals were rather common in the Northern Song. And around 1100s, they even made their appearance on those tomb walls. This tradition was carried into the subsequent Jin dynasty. Despite the toppled Northern Song regime in northern China, a tomb from Shanxi contained a set of 4 paintings that feature women as artists and literati. These women are engaged in scholarly arts, playing qin zither, weiqi chess, and appreciating painting and calligraphy. Note in the 2 images of painting and calligraphy, the mural painter also included a set of brushes on the ground. This is painting. It's not clear, but here is a brush stand and also their brush. Well, in this painting, we can still see the brush, right? Okay. But still we can see them, although they are not very clear, but still we see them. Apparently, these women were presented as painters and calligraphers themselves. So they not only appreciate calligraphy and painting, they also could do it. Such paintings were also popular in the contemporary secular art. Zhao Bixiang, a Southern Song scholar, wrote 4 poems about a set of screen paintings that contain women engaging in the 4 arts. Later, these 4 arts, zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting, were considered the essential oeuvre of a cultured woman. This tradition can be traced back at least to the Southern Song period, if not as early as the Northern Song. In addition to the different traits emphasized here, there are other stylistic differences between the Tang and the Song dynasty 仕女图. Women in the Tang paintings have plump bodies, round shoulders, full cheeks, and often wear heavy makeup, right? So we can see that. 仕女 figures in the Southern Song paintings are much slimmer. Their faces are narrower and less adorned than their Tang dynasty predecessors. In many cases, their heads appear disproportionately large when compared to their bodies, and their shoulders unnaturally slanted. As discussed earlier in this painting, textual records suggest that Tang style continued into the Northern Song. Major stylistic changes did not occur until the mid-11th century. The painting is excavated from Ciyun Buddhist temple in Ganzhou, Jiangxi province, testify to the long-lasting Tang style. Dated to 1014 CE or slightly earlier, the figures in these paintings are still the typical 4-figured, round-cheeked, and heavily adorned Tang type, although it's already 11th century in the Northern Song dynasty. This suggests that the Tang style existed until at least the 2nd decade of the 11th century. 2 murals from Zhengzhou and Luoyang, cultural and economic center of Northern Song, offer visual evidence that indicates the Tang style 仕女 were prevalent even in late 11th century. The grooming mural in Baisha Tomb No. 1, dated 1099, show 5 women with round faces and double chins, features typical in the Tang style. It is worth noting that in the portrait of the deceased couple, the artist differentiated the hostess of the tomb from the anonymous women in the back with narrower faces and slim square chins. The visual difference suggests that the anonymous women in Northern Song tombs are a generic and idealized type, and therefore similar to those portrayed in 仕女图 paintings produced for non-burial purposes. The female figures in Li Shou Gui's tomb, dated 1097, include both Tang-style figures and the more light-figured Southern Song type. So here, we already saw this picture before, while the mother here still has this round, like full cheeks, while this young woman, presumably a maid, has narrow face and a slanted shoulder. And in another two mirrors from the same tomb, we also see this slanted shoulders and also narrower faces. So in this tomb, we see kind of mixture of Tang and Song Dynasty Shinutu style. And the tombs from Licun, Xin'an, both dated to 1120s, so that's like right at the eve of Northern Song Dynasty, provided solid evidence that proves the full-fledged Southern Song style appeared no later than the ending phase of the Northern Song. The female figures in the two tombs show many stylistic similarities to those from the Southern Song. And here are two paintings, people from the Southern Song Dynasty, and we can see here large heads, right, when compared to the body, and also slant shoulders here and here, right, and also their faces are not that as full as the Tang Dynasty women. The slim figures, sharply slanted shoulders and forward protruding neck, the head and torso ratio, and the side-looking posture of the female figures in these two later Song paintings, later Northern Song paintings, are features typical of the Southern Song Shinyu style. They certify that the Southern Song Shinyu figures appeared in the capital region in the ending phase of the Northern Song, if not earlier. The transition of Shinyu from the Tang to the Song type was completed before the foundation of the Southern Song Dynasty. Two mirrors can be consulted to study extant paintings. The small album, Women Holding Fans, is one of a few Shinyu paintings survived from the Song Dynasty. Although traditionally attributed to the late Southern Song and early Yuan period artist Qian Xuan, this painting bears no seal or signature of the artist. The carefully delineated lines and delicate applied colors do not match other paintings by this artist either. The clothing, posture, and body proportions of the two women are typical of those from the Southern Song period Shinyu figures. The headpiece of the lady on the left, this one, although not seen in extant Song paintings, was worn by many female figures in the two mirrors from last decades of the Northern Song. So these are all two mirrors. We can see the same kind of headpiece, right, as the lady who from in this painting wears. The other lady in this painting has a much fancier headpiece, multiple layered kind of cap. But however, except for the extraordinary tall cap on the top, all of the pieces have been seen in Northern Song tomb mirrors. The woman's flower-shaped guan headpiece, so this one looks like flowers, right? Looks very similar to this woman's guan. And the red ribbon she wears looks similar to the one worn by another woman from Dengfeng, Henan province. And the long pin she has that goes from here and through the guan and then ends here. Although this pin has a phoenix-shaped head and appears more elaborate, fancier, its function remains the same, that is, to keep the guan headpiece in place. Such hair decorations and headpieces are not seen in extant Southern Song paintings or mirrors from the first half of the Northern Song. But in these paintings, we can see most of the ladies wear this kind of pin-like thing that goes through the guan headpiece. So the function is to make this headpiece stay on the head. This visual evidence suggests an earlier date for the earlier date of Northern Song instead of Southern Song dynasty. Well, traditionally people believe this painting is by Qian Xuan, artist who lived at the ending phase of Southern Song, but the mirrors from Northern Song dynasty suggest an earlier date for this painting. So conclusion. The current research proves the connection between images of women in secular and mortuary paintings from Northern Song tombs in the aspects of subject matter and artistic style. These findings make the Northern Song tomb mirrors valuable visual resources for the study of Shinyu Tu. The images of women in this mirror suggest that the Tang-style Shinyu Tu continued into mid-Northern Song period, and the typical Song style became fully developed by the end of Northern Song, thematically and stylistically, which then was carried on by the Southern Song artist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Given the time constraint, I didn't spell out all Professor Liu's publications, and I may have to omit our next speaker's long list of publications as well. Our next speaker is Laura Blanchard. She is Luce Professor of East Asian Art and Architecture at Harvard and the William Smith Colleges. Professor Blanchard's scholarly interests include Chinese pictorial arts from the Song Dynasty through the contemporary period, construction of gender in art, women as artists and patrons, text-image relationships, and Chinese theories of representation. She has published quite a few books. The one just mentioned by Wen Qian's Song Dynasty Figures of Longing and Desire, Gender and Interiority in Chinese Painting and Poetry. That is 2018 publication. Today's topic of her talk is Women as Collators in Chinese Art History. Some notes on reading Tang Shuyu's Jade Terrace History of Painting. Welcome, Dr. Blanchard.
Thank you so much to everybody who's been involved with organizing this conference. Obviously, everybody has been thanking JP because he did so much work, but we're also, of course, grateful to people like Carol Stepanchuk, and it's really, really wonderful to be back here. Of course, we also have to thank Marty, and if you'll just indulge me for 1 minute, I was thinking as we were listening to the papers in the first panel, when people were talking about exactly the kinds of things that Marty was always thinking about, cultural exchanges and thinking about China in the context of everything happening in the world. That was something he was already doing when I was a student. And now we've had this panel. He always encouraged me in my thinking about women and gender. And so now we have these 3 people, right, who have been presenting on these topics and using the kinds of things that he always taught us to do. It really struck me when Bo and Wen Qian were using poetry. It's oh yes, this is exactly, we were always reading poetry and always thinking about what that meant for art. So I just wanted to point out that I feel like Marty's teaching is really evident in everything we've seen so far. Okay, so now my topic. So I'm going to apologize really quickly for the title. When I had to come up with this title, I didn't quite know what I was doing yet. I knew I was interested in the idea that this woman, Tang Shuyu, who compiled this history, this Jade Terrace history of painting, I was interested in her as a collator, but I didn't quite know where I was going, and so that's why it's just some notes on reading Tang Shuyu's Jade Terrace history of painting, because I knew I would be reading it, I just didn't know what my conclusion was. Now, I hope I have a better idea now. Okay. In the Northern Song dynasty, an imperial wife named Cao Zhongwan achieved renown as a painter. 5 of her compositions entered the imperial collection and were recorded in the early 12th century Xuanhe painting catalog, the Xuanhe Huapu. The catalog describes her as an excellent painter, one who avoided painting the types of subjects known to be pleasing to women. As it says, the type of pleasant and feebly charming compositions that girls choose for enjoyment. And also, this excerpt insinuates that Cao Zhongwan's ability as a painter exceeded what women were normally considered capable of. I was really struck by this one sentence. It was truly as though, through her travels, she obtained beautiful scenes of rivers, lakes, and landscapes that she had viewed, and then collated them as fine compositions, as if she hadn't really been an artist at all, but she had just been like gathering other people's paintings and then putting them together to make her own work. So that was the passage from Shunhe Huapu, and then it's reproduced 700 years later. So this note on Cao Zhongwan's work from Shunhe Huapu appears nearly verbatim in the Jade Terrace History of Painting, the Yutai Huashi, which provides information on female artists in the imperial period, and that's really the text I'm going to be talking about today. The Jade Terrace History of Painting was itself collated by a woman, Tang Shuyu. Her name is also rendered Tang Soyu, as often I think as a way of avoiding confusing her with another historical figure with a name that's pronounced identically. At any rate, I'm also going to apologize for my images. You know, Wen Chen had beautiful images, and Boa said that her images were going to be homely and not beautiful, although I don't agree with that. I unfortunately only have images of this book. There's no art at all. This could really also be like Catherine's art history without art. I'm sorry about that. All right, so this particular passage, let me see if I can figure out how to make the pointer work. So here's the entry in Jade Terrace History of Painting. This is the title, Ms. Cao Cao Shi. And then this is basically the designation of the name of the source, Shunhe Huapu, and then this passage that I have partially translated, it actually goes on, you know, basically sort of appears here. Tang Shuyu, the compiler, lived in Qiantang as the wife of a scholar, Wang Yuansun, who was born in 1794 and died in 1836. And he was known in part for his stewardship of the Zhenqi Tang, which was the personal library started by his great-grandfather. Wang Yuansun published Tang Shuyu's book in 1837 under the library's imprint. And what I'm showing you here is the title page of the Jade Terrace History of Painting on the right. And then on the left, this is actually the second page of this book. So this is where we have the so-called publishing colophon, right? So basically, this basically says that this is from Qiantang. The name of the library is here, the Zhenqi Tang, that's there. But so basically, he actually publishes this as the imprint of his library. Marcia Widener has written about this in the past, and she has observed that the existence of that library undoubtedly facilitated Tang Shuyu's work. The bulk of the Jade Terrace History of Painting consists of excerpts from earlier art historical writings, with sources clearly marked, as I have already pointed out. So again, like at the beginning of every entry, we usually have like the name of the person. This is the entry on the Ming Dynasty courtesan, Shi Su. So that's her name there. And then the first text that she's citing from is the Ming Shizong. You know, here's another, basically she's like naming all of her texts sort of at the beginning of each passage. So the bulk of her text consists of excerpts from earlier writings. Some of them are art history, some of them are other kinds of sources, as I will be discussing. But she always clearly marks her sources at the beginning. And then at the end of some entries, Tang Shuyu is including her husband's commentary on the artists. So this particular entry also has one of those. So his commentary is actually shown beginning over here. And then there's, you know, this little bit that's his comment or his annotation on this entry. Tang Shuyu's own writing appears only in the final chapter. So it's a 5-chapter book, and then there's a chapter at the end that's her own observations. And what is happening in that final chapter is that she is giving the reader biographical information about early 19th century women painters, basically the women of her own era, we believe. So my paper is considering the gendered implications of Tang Shuyu's work and reflecting on what she accomplished with the publication of the Jade Terrace History of Painting. I argue that Tang Shuyu, like many women editors of the late Ming and early Qing, conceived of her text as a way of showcasing women's cultural productions. Yet, at the same time, she foregrounds the contributions of the male authors of the earlier texts. And she also foregrounds her husband's own commentary. And that means that she's deliberately minimizing any sense of her own critical perspective. What does it mean for a woman to be a collator, particularly in an art historical context? The example of Cao Zhongwan and her landscape paintings notwithstanding, and there I realize I was translating a bit loosely. Here I am really defining collating narrowly as a literary practice of collecting and compiling textual materials. Women had been described as collators since at least the time of the Tang Dynasty courtesan poet Shui Tao, from the late 8th and early 9th centuries. And the usage of the term jiaoshu remained current in the late Ming, when the courtesan Shui Susu, whose entry we see here, used a seal with these characters, and that led men to designate her this way in their biographies of poets. In fact, that word collator, or a variant term for it, actually appears in this text. Let me see if I can, it's actually really hard for me to look at this and talk and see. But here's actually that variant term for collator. It's a different character for jiao, but it is also read jiaoshu. So collator was a term of literary identity. Historians draw distinctions among the different activities of collating, proofreading, annotating, and editing. Proofreading and annotating, I think we all understand. But the difference between collating and editing is this. An editor would often introduce his or her own critical perspective. A collator did not necessarily do that, at least not overtly. In the late Ming and early Qing dynasties, a number of women were editing anthologies of women's poetry. Insofar as such works sought to call attention to women's literary productions, they seem analogous to what Tang Shuyu was doing with the Jade Terrace history of painting. Ellen Widmer's study of several of these anthologies indicates that their female editors were concerned with, with promoting the feminine tradition in poetry, sometimes in order to preserve examples of women's writing. Tang Shuyu may have aspired to do the same for women's painting. As an unillustrated written text, I did mention that there are no pictures, the Jade Terrace history of painting was ill-suited to preserve a pictorial composition in the way that a poetic anthology could reproduce whole poems or even fragments of writing. But by collating information about women painters in a single publication, Tang Shuyu could indicate the scope of women's participation in painting throughout the dynasties. Most of the entries present biographical information that could include the artist's names, courtesy names, literary names, names of fathers and or husbands, native places, names of painters they followed, what subjects they specialized in, as well as what other talents they might have, and in some cases, information on particular paintings, including titles and seals and inscriptions. Tang Shuyu also includes entries for figures about whom very little information is known. The two briefest entries in the whole book are those of an unnamed Song Dynasty woman, which reads, "The second daughter of Zhu Zi, who married Shu Kan of Changshan, was good at painting." And then the second, also very short, is about a Ming Dynasty courtesan, Wu Meixian, which simply says, Meixian, a courtesan of Jinling, excelled at painting. By including even such short accounts, Tang Shuyu is ensuring that these women are not overlooked. The first 5 chapters of the Jade Terrace history of painting are organized around painters' social identities. This is one way that Tang Shuyu reveals which women painted. The first chapter, which is called Palace Chambers, is devoted to court women. The second and third chapters are called basically Famous Beauties 1 and 2. These are wives and daughters, and I'm actually, one of the things that Marty always taught us was to be really careful with our language, and so I struggle to describe what kinds of families these women were coming from. They were often from families of scholars. They were often from artistic families. They were the kinds of families that literary scholars often refer to as gentry families, but I feel like the word gentry may be one that I need to think about a little bit more, so I'm being very careful here. The fourth chapter is dedicated to concubines and maids, and that one's actually named very straightforwardly, just concubines and maids. And then the fifth chapter is on famous courtesans. This organization by social identity is similar to the organizational schemes of 3 collections of women's poetry that were edited by women in the late Ming and early Qing dynasties. So the earliest of those is the classic of poetry by famous women, the Ming Yuan Shiwei, which was completed in 1664 by Wang Duanshu, and it is actually an anthology that features over 1,000 women poets. It also begins with a chapter on palace women, and it determines its order of categories in part by social status and by what Ellen Widmer has described as the perceived virtue of the women. So that in that particular schematic, courtesans who are possibly the least virtuous come dead last. The second and the third poetic anthologies, which are, I think in some ways similar to what Tang Shuyu is doing, they are also following this type of organization, and they are also much closer to Tang Shuyu's time. So one of these is the Anthology of Correct Beginnings by Women of this Dynasty, the Guoqiao Guixiu Zhengshi Ji, by the female editor Yunju. It's an anthology featuring about 1,500 poets, and it was published in 1831. And then the third is the Remarks on Poetry by Famous Women, Mingyuan and Shihua, edited by Shen Shanbao and published in 1845. Wang Duanshu and Shen Shanbao were both sensitive to preserving women's poems in the face of biases against their writing, while Yunju was interested in how a woman's writing could reflect her virtue, and seems to have wanted to promote virtue among her readers. Perhaps Tang Shuyu's adoption of a similar organizational scheme in her compilation indicates that she too wished to emphasize connections between painting and virtue. Where Tang Shuyu diverges from these women editors is in the absence of her critical voice. Wang Duanshu included editorial comments on each of her 1,000 poets and wrote a discourse on all the ways that women's poems came to be overlooked. Yunju wrote editorial prefaces for each poem in her anthology, and if you remember, her anthology has 1,500 poets, so, even more poems. Shen Shanbao included commentary on women's learning and how it relates to poetry. Tang Shuyu does none of these things. There is a preface in her book, but it's not written by her. Her first 5 chapters do not feature her voice at all. And then her habit of identifying her source at the beginning of each textual passage means that the reader of Jade Terra's History of Painting is always conscious of the extent to which her book relies on other people's observations and critical remarks. Her husband's comments are infrequent, but these two begin always in the same way. They always begin, Jie Xian Man Shi says, using his literary name. So that's in Chinese, Jie Xian Man Shi Yue. And that's, again, Wang Yuansun's literary name. By my count, there are only 9 such comments throughout the entire text, which covers 224 painters. Nevertheless, because Tang Shuyu avoids making any commentary at all in the main text, each of the historical entries clearly represents, first and foremost, someone else's assessment of or observations about the woman artist under discussion. Wang Yuansun clearly approved of Tang Shuyu's literary undertaking. Her citation of his comments indicates his involvement with the project, and she must have relied on his Zhenqi Tang library to complete her history. Again, this was a really famous library in Qiantang, basically featuring collecting over at least 4 generations. The range of sources that Tang Shuyu is citing indicates, again, that she's using this library because she's citing art historical texts, poems and commentaries on poetry, literary collections, biographies, dynastic histories, various kinds of literary jottings, and even annals of different locales and memorial steles. The Wang family as a whole seems to have been supportive of women's literary pursuits. Wang Yuansun had another wife, Liang Duan, who compiled a text that was titled Collations and Annotations to Biographies of Women, Lian Yu Zhuan Jiao Zhu. That was a study that she began about 1812, and which Wang Yuansun had published in 1831 after her death. Wang Yuansun also had a first cousin once removed, Wang Duan, born 1793, died 1839, who was a well-known female poet who compiled her own anthology of Ming poetry. That was published in 1839. And since she was almost an exact contemporary of Wang Yuansun and also from Qiantang, it seems likely that he was aware of her work. The scholar Clara Wingzheng He has argued that men who supported women's writing and worked to get it published were helping to reinforce cultural ideals of educated women. In a number of ways, Tang Shuyu looks to her male art historical forebears for inspiration. For insight into her work, it is useful to compare it to the Yuan Dynasty compilation Treasured Mirror of Painting, Tu Hui Bao Jian, which was authored by Xia Wenyan in the Yuan Dynasty. Tang Shuyu was clearly familiar with the source, as she cites it for 14 entries of Song and Yuan dynasty women painters. Here I'm actually showing you the table of contents. Sha's first 4 chapters concern the dynasties prior to his own, and he borrows from published art histories in those chapters. Sometimes he quotes verbatim from these, but he also edits his source material, summarizing or paraphrasing where he finds it useful. What he doesn't do, though, is he doesn't include a source citation. His passages never begin, Shunhe Huapu says this. It always seems like his own writing, even though he's clearly citing. The 5th chapter contains what Deborah Delgais Muller judged to be Sha's original observations about Yuan dynasty painters, organized according to the painters' social identities. So chapter 5 in the table of contents is here, and basically it just says Yuan Chao, it's on the Yuan dynasty, and also foreigners, Waiguo. Similarly, Tang Shuyu's first 5 chapters concern eras prior to her own, for which she borrows explicitly from other sources, and her final chapter focuses on her own era and consists of what seemed to be her own commentary on 19th century women painters. Like Xia Wenyan, Tang Shuyu sometimes edits her source material. However, her consistent identification of her sources gives the impression that she is presenting that material unfiltered. In many cases, as with the passages originating from Treasured Mirror of Painting, that is exactly what she is doing. She cites Xia Wenyan virtually verbatim in every instance, only occasionally substituting a variant character or two, as in her entry for a Song Dynasty maid named Cui Chiao. But especially with the longer entries, and so here again we have the Xue Su Su entry, she sometimes finds it expedient to cite only the parts that are relevant to a woman's painting activity. This is the case with her entry here on this courtesan. I wanted to point out the text that is based on a passage from Zhu Yizun. It's called Remarks on Poetry from the Jingzhi Dwelling, the Jingzhi Zhu Shihua. Zhu Yizun was somebody who was writing in the 17th and early 18th centuries. So that entry, the Jingzhi, let me see. So that's actually beginning here. That's this particular passage. I actually have a translation. So the part of that text that Tang Shuyu cites reads as follows in my translation. I have seen collator Xue Wu, and her personal sketches in inkwash of bodhisattvas were extremely good. Dong Shangshu, on the day of the Imperial Civil Service examinations, received her calligraphy in Hezhong and loved it from the moment he saw it, and for her he wrote the Heart Sutra in small standard script along with a colophon. She made landscapes, orchids, and bamboo with quick sweeps of her brush. Not unexpectedly, she was able to enter the inspired class. Okay. If we look at Zhu Yizun's original passage, it's much longer. And so here I have the passage that is from the J. Terrace History of Painting at the top, and I have Zhu Yizun's much longer passage at the bottom, and the characters in yellow are basically where the two texts are overlapping. If translated into English, Zhu Yizun's original passage would begin, collator Xue Wu had 10 skills, poetry, prose, zither, sword, flute, and galloping on horseback, rope dancing, shooting. She was especially a preeminent artist. I have seen her personal sketches in inkwash of bodhisattvas, which were extremely good. And then basically he sort of continues very much in the same way that Tang Shuyu does, right up to the end of this bit about the inspired class. And then he goes on a lot longer, especially about the shooting on horseback. And clearly, Tang Shuyu has edited this really long passage, and she's making a natural decision that she's only going to focus on Xue Susu's painting activities, and she's going to cut the information about all of this courtesan's other talents, especially the lengthy description of her exploits that involve shooting on horseback. In other cases, and here I have the entry on Guan Daosheng, the famous Yuan dynasty painter. In other cases, Tang Shuyu decides to summarize material in ways that are more difficult to explain. So this sort of decision is apparent in her 5-page entry on Guan Daosheng, who lived from 1262 to 1319. I'm actually only showing you the first 3 pages here because I couldn't get them all into a single slide. For this entry, she actually cites 5 sources, and she includes a comment by her husband. And one of the sources is by Bian Yongyu, a study of calligraphy and paintings of the Shigu Hall, the Shigu Tang Shu Hua Hui Kao. So that's an art historical text. Tang Shuyu renders one part of his passage. I'm actually going to give you that particular thing in a minute, but let me see if I can quickly point out where this is. So basically, Bian Yongyu is beginning here. Okay. Tang Shuyu renders one part of his passage as follows. Mrs. Guan's ink bamboo with inscriptions. The scroll illustrates Yang Wanli's Rhapsody on this Gentleman. Dong Zongbo wrote an inscription for it as follows. Mrs. Guan painted a picture of an embroidered Buddha image in a mountain tower. Her work was an equal match to that of Lord Obo. As for her letters, written in running and standard script, these two were almost indistinguishable from his. She is like Lady Wei, who in later years had no peers. In this scroll, the bamboo branches and crisscrossing brushstrokes are wonderful, as if blown about by wind and rain, also resembling Gongsun Danyang, dancing the sword dance. Paintings of the women's quarters have a distinctive character, and this is not that type. Strange, strange. So this all seems straightforward. Tang Shuyu gives the title of the painting. It's a bamboo painting. She identifies a textual source for it, Yang Wanli's Rhapsody. And she transcribes the inscription by Dong Qicheng. But if we look at the original source, it becomes clear that Bian Yongyu was actually describing two completely different paintings. The first of them is titled Mrs. Guan's Ink Bamboo with the text of Rhapsody on this Gentleman, or in Chinese, Guan Fu Ren Mo Ju Tu Bing Shu Ci Jun Fu Juan. This painting is based on Yang Wanli's Rhapsody, which Guan Daosheng wrote out. And actually, I didn't actually translate all of that, because it's actually a really long poem. Bian Yongyu is transcribing the Rhapsody in its entirety, and he describes 3 of Guan Daosheng's seals. The second painting is titled Bamboo in 6 Segments, a completely different painting, Ju Liu Duan, and this is the painting inscribed by Dong Qicheng as recorded in Tang Shuyu's text. Bian Yongyu mentions that this painting is done in ink on paper, that it is signed by Guan Daosheng, and that it bears 2 of Dong Qicheng's seals, but Tang Shuyu omits all of that information. At any rate, digging into an entry like this one makes it clear that Tang Shuyu is actually sometimes editing her sources, but her text includes no signals that she is working as an editor. Instead, by always starting with the source citation, she seems to encourage the reader to assume that she is simply working as a collator. Tang Shuyu's final chapter of fewer than 10 pages is perhaps the one place in her text where we clearly see her own commentary. At least this is my assumption, based on the fact that she cites no sources for this material, not even her husband's comments. In her commentary, she appears to follow the lead of Wang Yuansun, whose remarks in the main text tend toward first-hand observations rather than criticism. And just to give you an example of one of his comments, because I've pointed out that he's making them, but I haven't discussed what they're like. His most critical comment is on a Qing Dynasty woman's painting, where he is actually making a brief comment on the quality of the work. It reads, Sun Yunhe, or Shilin, gave me a small landscape painting by Caizhi Shanren, which was the literary name of Wang Liang, in rich greens and wet mist. It doesn't resemble the brushwork of the women's quarters. Here he makes the somewhat common value judgment that much of women's painting is recognizable as such by the quality of the brushwork. Tang Shuyu's interest in virtue and how it is reflected through women's painting comes through most clearly in an entry that she put into her final chapter. It's written for the 19th century painter Wu Guichen, and it reads, Wu Guichen, courtesy names Fei Qing and Xianglun, was from Jintan. She was a wife of district magistrate Gu Lusong, or He, of Wuxian. She received praise for her filial piety. For painting, she studied the work of Nan Tian. Her wind in the branches and dew on the leaves was naturally refined and pretty. She was also skilled at traditional medicine. When Lu Song was a magistrate in Mijie, he went on a military expedition to Kashgar, and Fei Qing remained at home in Wumen. Her parents-in-law both relied on her paintings to provide for them. Those women of recent times who are good at painting, such as Shen Cai Shi, or Jue, of Jiaxing at landscapes, Gu Wanfang, or Hui, of Wu at flowers and plants, and Huang Gengwan, or Zhishu, of Nanhai at orchid and bamboo, are making this the age of champions. What a lot of talent coming from the women's quarters. Following the standard biographical information, this entry primarily focuses on Wu Guichen's filial piety, discussing her painting activity in the context of providing for her parents-in-law in her husband's absence. Tang Shuyu says little about the quality of Wu Guichen's painting. She clearly regards her as talented, yet the comment that her painting is refined and pretty is remarkably nonspecific and seems to be the kind of thing one might expect to be said of women's painting in general. In this way, Tang Shuyu seems to agree with her husband that the brushwork of the women's quarters has a recognizable flavor. At the same time, she happily remarks on how many talented women painters there are in her own era, supporting the argument that she was seeking to promote women's art. In conclusion, the J. Terrace History of Painting is an important text for what it tells us about women's participation in the arts. The 224 featured women painters, yes, but also the text's 19th century female collator. Tang Shuyu proudly sought to promote a feminine painting tradition and to preserve knowledge of women artists, and she may also have drawn connections where she could between women's art and virtue. But in choosing to present herself as a collator and deliberately concealing her editorial work, she seems to defer to other authorities, not only the many male critics, connoisseurs, and historians whose work she draws upon, but also her husband, and she does not register herself as a strongly critical presence in the work. Her husband fully supports her endeavor, and without his contributions, the project would likely have been impossible to realize. The J. Terrace History of Painting, far from being the work of a single woman working independently, represents the many voices that have ensured that women's contributions to Chinese painting have not been wholly overlooked. But it also suggests that its female collator herself is positioning herself as a virtuous model of female learning. Thank you.
Time for questions. Yes, Susan.
Thanks.
The choices that show different accomplishments, playing chess, calligraphy, etc. Do you know whether the deceased Henri or the seeds of grooming was a female deceased person, or was it a male showing his appreciation of cultivated? Do you have any correlation between the scenes and the deceased?
I think that's for you.
Okay, for me. Okay. Okay.
And then I'll come to you.
So here we're talking about two tombs. One is the painting that shows women writing and, okay.
Moving into paintings and calligraphy and playing chess.
Oh, that one is from the Jin Dynasty. So it's after Northern Song. Well, that painting, we don't know anything about tomb owner. Okay, and I wish I could find some information. But for the other one that contains two paintings of women writing and reading, it was a tomb for a couple.
So not necessarily.
Yeah, so far I haven't found the correlation.
And then Laura, I wondered, you referred at one point to a female publisher, not necessarily a co-writer, but a publisher.
I don't
Sort of in passing.
I don't know if I did refer to a female publisher. I think editors, yes, absolutely editors.
And so would a woman in that position, how would she have achieved that position? What would be the financial, and I guess I wonder, legal, her legal situation?
Right.
Would she have been a widow, for example, to have had the presumed independence to undertake that kind of activity?
Okay, that's a great question. And actually, this is, because I really am an art historian, this is actually getting a little bit away from my field of expertise. But what I know about it is that the female editors who were working on anthologies of women's poetry were very much like Tang Shuyu, working with the complete support of their husbands. So often their husbands were supportive of them in their endeavors. They weren't necessarily widows, or they were often married women. And it seems to me to be the case that they happened to be in marriages that supported women's scholarship. Yeah.
papers are very informative, and I learned a lot, and also they're very interesting ideas. I have one question for the first two papers, and maybe one comment for the third. The question is actually rather big, but I'd love to know your ideas. So when we see this kind of beautiful woman painting, very sexy, very revealing, either from Han or from Ming or Qing, we often assume that they were made for man, or they were owned for man. Actually, in your talk, you sort of take that view. But if we read the text, or if we see the actual example, women actually also own this painting, display this painting in their quarters, and the different women. Like a Tang tombs, there's the princess tombs, have plenty of these female images in them. And like a Ming Qing, Hong Lou Meng is even Jiamu has a beautiful woman painting. And Qing Ke Qing has a Tang tombs, beautiful woman painting. So women have painting. James Cahill demonstrated basically the course house had this kind of big painting. That's for true. Beyond that, even this called the gentle lady or the noble woman, they also own these kind of sexy, this kind of painting. So I just would like to know, how do you explain this? Can we simply just use man, woman, binary to explain this? My comment or maybe a question for your wonderful paper. You get such a detailed reading, really reveal a lot of things about the creator. Tang Shuyu, I think is really very suggestive. I totally agree with you about her goal and the role she assumed. But one thing is that she didn't write down a lot of comments, or I feel because she's compiling painting history, as you say, without painting.
Right.
So therefore, it's very different from like a poetry collection.
Absolutely.
Because poetry collection, you do have to work, so the compiler can comment. In her case, the early things, she didn't have any painting. So there's no way she could talk about painting.
Yes.
But still, I believe she did see some later paintings.
Yeah, I
For
think.
example, her husband say,
yes.
I had this Xu Su Su, I saw Shan Mian, probably she also said.
Actually,
So exactly
yes.
I agree with you.
Right.
She is sort of didn't want to comment on it.
Yeah.
But maybe you can add just that she's not dealing with original work.
She,
It's
yes.
more like an archival.
Right.
It's more about real collection.
Right.
It's about archives.
Yeah. Are you guys ready to respond, or do you want me to go first?
Thank you, for Professor Wu Hong's comments. I actually totally agree with you that the so-called male gaze or desire is only one of the sort of aspect behind all these beautiful women images. Professor Cahill actually wrote a paper about where this kind of painting hung, that addressing this issue that women chambers also has this kind of they do display this kind of paintings, and as a token of the expression their desire, their longings, not necessarily just for the male gaze. In my paper, I didn't really discuss that. I'm just telling, I just kind of like state that it's a common sort of a assumption. The scholarly agree that for this part, courtesan images of the beautiful woman, seeing them as the courtesan. That's actually my whole argument. I don't think that's the case. I think that's the generic Marian images actually is some sort of like a container, or it actually could receive much more kind of identities or negotiation that we found that. It's also for the gentry women as well as other type, expression of the female designs. That I totally have to agree with you. And there's evidence, obviously, the women actually has can't remember exactly where I saw that image there, depiction of women viewing those type of the paintings, the small albums, as the beautiful woman album, and the viewer actually is a woman. So it's not just for the men. There available, you have comments?
For Ming Dynasty, I don't know much, but for Tang and Song Dynasty, I won't make the statement that in the Tang Dynasty, there were also women who were enjoying those Meiren painting that features obviously sexually like attractive women, because based on the writings left from the Tang Dynasty, the artists mostly they were men, and also the writers they show their appreciation of those beautiful women images. They were also men, and also okay, there is this interesting poem left by Tang Dynasty artist who was also a poet, and he painted an image of a beautiful woman. Actually, it's called Meiren too. So maybe it's some another direction that I should go. In my opinion, Meiren tu and Shini tu, they are kind of separate thing. Okay, Meiren tu emphasizes the beautiful look and also the sexual attractiveness of the lady, while these Tang Dynasty writers, they were not kind of ashamed of showing their appreciation of female sexuality. This writer wrote in a poem about beautiful women's screen painting, and he said, the last line reads, this painting makes his sense goes wild. Okay, but in the Song Dynasty, we don't see male scholars openly admit that they were attracted by those images of beautiful women. On the contrary, they often state that they were not attractive at all. They were not attracted at all. There are poems like this. Li Gang wrote one, and also there were Michelson who said, this beautiful lady who could, not beautiful lady, this young girl who can write beautiful calligraphies, I would like to have a companion like this, something like this. So, and for some of the fan paintings, I tend to think many of those fan paintings were actually owned by women, because in the Song Dynasty, both men and women use this round fan. They put the fan in a little pocket in their sleeve. So, but because we lack the information about who were viewing and who owned those fan paintings, so I cannot make any statement about it. But my opinion, my guess is some of those fan paintings that features women taking care of children, women reading or writing or painting artworks, probably the owners were also women.
I'll just very quickly add, because that question was not really for me, that my own book makes that exact argument, that some of those paintings of Shinu Hua are actually intended for women, especially, as you say, the fan paintings. So, regarding Tang Shuyu, I completely agree that mostly she was not the one who was commenting on actual works of art in her book. Mostly she leaves that to her husband, and he's the one who's commenting on the Guandaosheng painting that his family owned, or the seals on the Shuasusu painting, or the various comments that he's making are always making it clear that he has firsthand knowledge of these works of art. But she always leaves it to him. And then in her own final chapter, the so-called supplementary record, what she is doing is she is actually sometimes commenting on women's compositions of her own era. But again, she's not really saying anything critical about them. So she'll say they're refined and pretty, or they're like a pair of jades, or she'll just make some kind of very innocuous and sort of appreciative comment, but it's not really a critical assessment of the quality of the work. So I do think that in that final chapter where she discusses 18 painters, she is actually commenting on those paintings. And I'm not sure why she felt like she could do it only there and not in the main text, why she didn't want to include. Because, if her husband is commenting on paintings, I'm assuming that she must have seen some of those too. I don't think he was always relying on a distant memory of something that was lost. I think there may have been some paintings in their collection. And I don't know why she didn't want to comment on those herself.
Yeah, just follow up. So Laura, do you think that it's a social positioning then, following practices of 17th century, how women 17th and early 18th century, how women positioned themselves as writers and painters?
Yes.
With their husbands' permission as a sales tactic?
Yes, yes.
And therefore...
That is exactly my argument, that it's a matter of social positioning, that she's trying to show that she is appropriately deferential to her husband, and that makes her virtuous. Yeah.
May I abuse my privilege to ask a bunch of questions and make some comments? follow this question about the social position. Actually, I'm sure you're familiar with historian Susan Mann and Dorothy Cole's work.
course, yes.
Both argued and also demonstrated very convincingly 明清才女. We have this subject position. We have the strong tradition 明清才女. So I would see Tang Shuyu is definitely in this framework that to Susan left, and that these women from elite families, they are male kings, either husbands or fathers or brothers. In Susan Mann's book, The Talented Women of Zhang's Family, talk about the brother will sponsor the sisters or aunties, whatever, whose work, okay? So, and that's a status symbol. Status symbol. Just like today, a lot of rich men sending their daughters to Harvard or whatever, right?
Yes.
That's status symbol. So a lot of talented women involved in this kind of artistic activities are strongly supported by families. So from today's presentation, I found, because we read Susan Mann's and Dorothy Cole's, we already know, taken it for granted as common knowledge that we have 明清才女 tradition because of it associated with the booming economy of the Jiangnan area. That's 明清才女, concentrating in the area. But today I found that, oh no, Liu Bo showed us way before 明清, right? Starting from Song, right? These women already the women already using brushes, doing painting and all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, the history should be rewritten. It's not just 明清we have 才女. We have a long time, just a kind of tradition. But my question is, why we only see 明清才女, this category, not much further? Maybe art historians should do more work. Maybe their work is all lost. Like, Tang Shuyu's work, I was expecting to see some pictures.
I'm sorry, I know.
I
was really interested in the text.
Hey, this one is about of women by women. I'm so eager to see by women, paintings by women. But so far we haven't seen anyone, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's something that I'm really curious to see.
Yeah.
I want to see some comparison between women's painting and men's painting. Of course, we heard a lot of wonderful artists, courtesans, they can paint 琴棋书画, that's normal standards. You have to master all these skills, right? We knew that. But we haven't seen anything.
Sorry.
So, yeah,
The reason why I didn't, there was a time constraint. And and actually, a lot of the art that survives from the women painters that are discussed in the text are not the exact compositions that are being discussed. So for there's a Susu painting that's described, and I can't find a picture of it anywhere. I don't know that it still survives. Guan Daosheng's work, Guan Daosheng,
So
the question about the authenticity of the surviving works that are attributed to her is, that makes that problematic.
And so to return to that, if there's difference between male painting and women painting, I do not think we should simply or simple-mindedly using the Western feminist concept of male gaze. Because I think a lot of these male paintings of female activities, even though it's in the chamber activity, I have another question for you. How come that those men can sit in women's chamber to do a portrait? What about, 男女授受不亲, right? That's very intimate in the chambers, So I don't know what happened there, or just they imagined all the male portraits of women just from their imagination, not a real portrait. I do not know. That's my question for Wenqian. But for these pictures of male produced, and especially Liu Bo's mural, right, depicting women's virtues, right? You emphasize that from too soon there's more women's virtues. That struck me as very much in the Confucian didactic tradition. So it's to use that murals or paintings as an educational tool to emphasize Confucian values for women, all those virtues that women should follow. So of course, their audience, expected audience, should be women, right? Just like all those Jia Gui, Jia Xun, right? These all men wrote for women, want women to follow all those virtuous deeds, right? So that's my comment. So not necessarily that the men produce the things just to project their erotic desires. Chinese men have more in their minds when they do.
Absolutely.
Yes. They can project their erotic desires in their Chun Gong to whatever. The others, like propaganda, you need to, shape up women's behavior and to train them as 贤妻良母, virtuous mothers and good wives, and in the family, to maintain the family order. That's more important. For all those desires, you can look in Chun Gong, pornography stuff, different functions. Right? Okay, that's my comment and some questions.
So for that last painting I show, I don't really have an answer why that woman shows in the men's study as I suggest, but I'm convinced it's not a typical women's study. If you look all the details that, including that the big, the gu shape, the vessel holding the peacock tails, that's the typical tails for the men's official hat. That's a symbol for the men's official status. And also very messy, the kind of the cabinet opens. There's no mirrors. There's no typical makeup scenes in that place. The place just really messy. Don't look like a ladies' room at all. So I don't really have an answer, but I suddenly feel like this might be a little bit subverting the idea, kind of turning this. What Professor Wang just mentioned, that okay, this is not just about men's fantasy. Women certainly have a very active role in that space. Actually, I feel, and so again, also this painting actually is done pretty late. Probably late into the late 19th century, as you can see a lot of European Western techniques, even the one single light sources techniques was involved there. So this must be a much later production that has a lot of other influences in there. So it's not a typical mirror that we place in a boudoir or kind of a female, more sort of feminine space. So that's actually quite interesting comments, but I can't answer why she's there. But I'm convinced that it's not a women's space, typical women's space.
So we have no idea how those male artists got into women's chambers to paint those beautiful women.
There is a painting, the Gong Chong Tu, the In the Palace. The first section of that, which is in the Bernard Berenson collection in Villa I Tatti, actually shows a male painter in the women's quarters.
Which dynasty?
Song Dynasty.
Oh, Song Dynasty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the one that's attributed to Zhou Wenju. It's supposed to be a copy after him.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Yes,
That does show a male painter making a portrait in the very first section.
Okay.
Well, all this is extremely enlightening for those of us who don't really study this material, but it's a little tame, and it does potentially, each of the three painters could potentially sort of serve to do exactly what Professor Zhang just pointed out, namely sort of reinforce Confucian-minded platitudes about harmony in the family. And I just wonder, coming from a position of total ignorance, whether it might not be useful, just as an experiment, to use queer theory to see what that can do to stir things up a little bit in coming up with alternative perspectives, which may be wrong, but which nevertheless may help you perceive these things without these kinds of intellectual straitjackets applied to the material. Just a suggestion.
Thank you.
I was wondering, Wenjin, if the poses, the woman with her knee up, if it's related to any one poses, or like where do you think that pose came from? Because it's repeated
Yeah, it definitely is opposed to the ease. You see that kind of royal ease, right?
Royal ease.
Yeah, but the royal ease does not expose the tiny bum feet. I think that the point is that the tiny, especially in the red shoes, the tiny bum feet that expose their burn out the sexuality. Yeah.
Charges it sexually by that.
Yeah, I guess that 曹大家's image is particularly interesting to me, intriguing. It's kind of played around that, between that. Her feet is not exposed. Her foot is not exposed, but she's sitting that position. At first I saw she's sitting a very awkward position, but then if I compare those, the very interesting, commonly thing gesture, they realized, oh, okay, that's the posture she's actually posing. Yeah.
I have a question for Bo, which is where the Liao fits into this narrative, right? So you talk about the shift from the Tang to the Northern Song by the mid-11th century, and then this depiction of learned women continues on into the Jin. But I seem to remember that in the Xuanhua tombs, there's also learned women with, or women standing around a writing table. And in general, I guess the Liao is generally connected to the Tang that precedes it rather than to the Song. But do you see that differently in this case?
Thank you for the question. The Xuanhua, it's a place in Hebei province, cemetery where tombs belong to two families were found, and most of the tombs were painted with colorful images. While for those tombs, we don't see typical connection between 仕女 painting and those mirror images, because the women in those paintings, they're mainly doing activities that serve the dead, like they were preparing food or they are holding stuff. So, but for my paper, in this case, I was trying to find when the shift from the emphasis on physical look to the intellectual type of a woman, when did this shift happen? While the images that portrayed women as intellectuals in tombs can only be found in Northern Song tombs, not in the Xuanhua painted tombs. Well, there is one tomb that belonged to a Liao Dynasty prince. Well, that tomb contains a famous concubine Yang writing, but it's a fixed painting subject called concubine Yang writing scripture. So I don't consider that that is a typical 仕女 painting as we understand from the Northern Song dynasty. Okay.
It's 5:30, so we need to really move on. Maybe you have last question? You still have question?
Yeah, it's really just out of curiosity, whether we know much about how women responded to the sight of art and responded to the sight of beauty. Because in 15th and 16th century Europe, one of the things that was said is that the reason why you should have beautiful paintings in your home is that you should hang them in the bedroom where babies are conceived. And I wondered whether in China there's any evidence that this was done, because it would produce, if women look at beautiful
Eugenics,
people while they're conceiving, they're going to produce beautiful children.
Well, in my study of the popular prints, actually images of women are considered very auspicious. Yeah, especially beautiful women images, they often put it in the bedchamber. Yeah, and people like to look at it, and they think, okay, surrounded by all this beautiful image, you got your wish, something like that. So definitely, it's a part of it. Yeah.
Let's.
I would add that
yes.
the painting attributed to Zhou Fang that I think both Wen Qian and Bo talked about, the ladies adorning their hair with flowers. That one, Ellen Johnston Lang has made an argument that it's the right dimensions to have been a screen painting. And of course, if it was a screen painting, you could easily imagine it next to a bed.
Yes.
And that's actually an argument I make in my book as well.
Okay, last one, then we have to conclude. Okay.
That is, I think Zhou Wenjian earlier commented on this you essentially identify a gendered space. So we're not talking about man, woman, who's gazing at what, that, that is not very interesting, and we cannot document all of that. So essentially, I think your work also is pointing to the problem of space, right? Whether it's a, private space or a woman's bedroom, or it seems that the most interesting drama takes place in a space which you identify as being gendered. And when you mentioned that attractive women do not appear in murals, so again, presence of women in a certain space. So what exactly is the politics here? So what is the gender politics here? So I think that might give us a better idea about the gender situation. I'm just giving you a suggestion. So that's what I get from your analysis. Very, very rich material that you presented here. So it's not a matter of gaze. And for instance, can you put a man's portrait in a woman's bedroom? Is that allowed? Is that illicit? So that's not the right space, right? So we're really talking about gender space, it seems.
Can I respond? So in the, let's say, in the Tang Dynasty, in the burial chamber, usually we see images of women because those burial chambers, they were meant to provide like a comfortable underground home for the dead. So in real life, women usually serve living people in the living room or family room. So that's where women usually were active. While we see in the burial chamber, usually we see images of women. While on the tunnel that leads to the burial chamber, we see a lot of men. Okay, but while in the Song Dynasty, what I was trying to find out, okay, I'm still working on it, is while in the Tang Dynasty, those women, their presence was to serve the dead. They provide all kind of utensils like back scratchers or snack or some other kind of supply for the dead. But then in the Song Dynasty, toward the end, we see images that are not directly related to how to serve the dead, like women writing, women reading, right? Or in the Jin Dynasty case, women were like playing chess. And so in my opinion, well, in the Song Dynasty and also coming Jin Dynasty, the space kind of gradually became a place where the tomb owner could express his or her thoughts instead of just providing images that could serve the dead on everyday life.
Okay. Let's give a round of applause to thank our speakers' wonderful paper. And also, please, everybody, please remain on your seat for a little bit. We will have Professor Tim Brooke to come to the podium to give a brief introduction to Marty's new book, China and England.
I'm not sure where to begin. So maybe I'll start at the end. And the end is that Marty beat me to it because I've had in my mind for at least a decade to write a book in which I thought about how England in the first half of the 17th century was trying to make sense of this changing global world that it was in and was going to look at China, and I was going to bring China into this. Well, it turns out Marty sent me the book last week, and he's already done it. So I guess I'm going to have to change my project. But no, I don't have to change my project because what he's done is he's moved the time frame really more to the 18th century, more to the period of the philosophes. I've been thinking, how should I introduce his book to you? He shared chapters of this several years ago with me. And there was a passage that particularly struck me when I was rereading the middle section yesterday. And he was saying that Europeans didn't have a term for someone who had gained authority by virtue of, it's male here, his education, his performance in the examinations, and his recognized ability to be an effective administrator. Europeans didn't know what to call those people. You had aristocrats and you had princes, but you didn't have competent people. There was no language for competence, because in Europe you were either born into the elite or you were not born into the elite. This is central to the argument that Marty is giving us in this book in a way that's so refreshing, because whenever England is going in one way, China seems to be going in the other, and whenever China turns around and goes in that way, England seems to be going in the other, and they're always misunderstanding each other. But this space of not misunderstanding, it's actually a moment of recognition, I think, among particularly French writers, but English writers as well in the early 18th century, that you have to call them philosophers. I mean, we now use Mandarin. Well, we don't use Mandarins much anymore, but you say officials or scholar gentry or something. We have language for this. Europeans in the 18th century didn't, so they had to call them philosophers. And I've been thinking about this because if Marty's new book is heir to anything, it's heir to the philosophers of the 18th century, who completely transposed to a different setting were trying to make sense of the world as it was expanding and changing around them. And they didn't have the language for what to call China. Many of them fell into despotism and so forth. Although despotism in the 18th century wasn't what it means for us today. It was a different concept then. But Europeans in the 18th century were struggling to make sense of this changing world. And so that's where I think Marty's new book sits. It sits in a point that we are all in now where, in a sense, we've all absorbed Said's Orientalism. We have all absorbed the critiques that Lydia and other people have made about the failure of the old language to capture the world in which we now find ourselves. We've done this, and now we've got to move forward and think, well, what do we do with this new understanding? How do we bring the rest of the world into what we know has regrettably been a Eurocentric discourse and is no longer so much a Eurocentric discourse? How do we genuinely bring Asia into our field of vision? And Marty's book just reminds me of how hard that is to do. And he's trying, I mean, it's really the most shockingly radical book in our field that I've read in a long time. I mean, Marty was already going there with pattern and person, I think. He was sort of heading in that direction of saying, I'm an art historian. I have tools that I can use to show you things that you weren't looking for and you didn't know you were looking for. Well, China and England, he just keeps going way off the far end on this. And it's really interesting. It's really a challenge. I think in a sort of, if I had a longer and more sober reflections, it would be to disagree with some of what he's saying. But there's not a page of the book in which I don't think, wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of doing it that way. So it's a remarkable journey for somebody who's, they have your dissertation out there on the display table. This is a bit of useless biography, but we were clearing out my mother's condo. We've moved her into a retired person's home. We were clearing out her condo, and there was a copy of my dissertation in her condo. And I thought, do I want to keep this or not? And I decided no. Nobody needs to read my dissertation, but we probably still need to read Marty's book. So what? I'm sorry, I'm wandering here a bit, but it's the luxury that we have as scholars and intellectuals. We can begin at point A, usually through a process of long, sometimes tedious training. But once we've got ourselves standing on point A, we can then start moving, and we can go off and use one set of tools on a lot of different projects. And what a geographer is going to bring to a problem compared to what an art historian is going to bring are going to be very different. But those two sets of tools are going to give us two new sets of results. So that's, I don't have any sort of grand finale to my comments, except to say that Marty is the philosopher among us, and I'm proud to be a friend of his. So, thank you.